The old trailer creaked and groaned in the morning wind, just like it did every day for the past 3 years. 16-year-old Maria Santos pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped outside into the crisp October air. The smell of pine trees mixed with the distant scent of smoke from someone's fireplace, creating that familiar autumn atmosphere that most people found comforting, but Maria barely noticed anymore. Her mother Rosa had already left for her first job at the diner downtown, her beat-up Honda disappearing into the morning mist before sunrise. By evening, Rosa would have worked at 3 different places, trying to keep food on the table and the lights on. Maria's father had vanished 2 years ago, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. Now it was just Maria, her mother, and her 2 younger brothers, 8-year-old Diego and 10-year-old Carlos. Maria had dropped out of school the previous spring. The guidance counselor had tried to convince her to stay, talking about her potential and her future. But potential didn't pay for groceries, and the future felt like something that happened to other people. While her former classmates worried about homecoming dances and college applications, Maria worried about whether they could afford to keep the electricity on another month. This morning was no different from any other. Diego needed help finding his school shoes. Carlos had forgotten to do his math homework again, and there was barely enough milk for their cereal. After getting her brothers ready and walking them to the bus stop, Maria found herself alone with the kind of silence that made her thoughts too loud. She had developed a habit over the past year of walking into the forest behind their trailer park. The woods were dense and peaceful, stretching for miles in every direction. Sometimes she would sit on a fallen log and imagine what it would be like to just keep walking, until she found a different life somewhere in those trees. Other times she collected firewood or looked for berries, anything that might help their situation even a little bit. Today felt different, though. Maybe it was the way the fog hung between the trees or how quiet everything seemed. Even the birds were barely chirping. Maria decided to venture deeper into the forest than usual, following a narrow deer path she had noticed before but never explored. As she walked, her sneakers crunching on fallen leaves, Maria let her mind wander. She thought about her friend Jessica, who had managed to stay in school and was already talking about college. Jessica's family had money, though, and a father who came home every night. Maria tried not to feel bitter about it, but sometimes the unfairness of everything hit her like a punch to the stomach. The path wound deeper into the woods, past towering Douglas firs and thick underbrush. Maria had been walking for almost an hour when she realized she was farther from home than ever before. She should probably turn back soon, but something kept pulling her forward. Maybe it was the need to feel like she was going somewhere anywhere, instead of being trapped in the same small problems every day. That's when she heard it. At first, Maria thought it might be a bird or some kind of small animal, but as she stopped and listened more carefully, her heart began to race. The sound was definitely crying, but not like any bird she had ever heard. It sounded almost like... No, it couldn't be. Following the sound, Maria pushed through some thick bushes, getting scratched by thorns in the process. The crying grew louder, more desperate. Her pulse quickened as she realized what she was hearing had to be human. But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? Then she saw it. Hidden behind a cluster of large boulders and partially concealed by low-hanging branches was what looked like some kind of makeshift shelter. Someone had built it using fallen branches, old tarps, and what appeared to be pieces of cardboard. It was crude but clearly constructed with intention, designed to provide protection from the weather. The crying was coming from inside. Maria's hands were shaking as she approached the shelter. Every instinct told her to be careful, to maybe run back home and get help. But the crying was so sad, so desperate, that she couldn't just walk away. Carefully, she pulled aside a piece of tarp that served as the entrance. What she saw inside made her gasp so loudly that she covered her mouth with both hands. 3 babies lay on a pile of dirty blankets, all of them crying weakly. They looked tiny and fragile, maybe a few months old at most. Their faces were red and wrinkled from crying, and even from a distance Maria could tell they were not well. Their cries were hoarse, like they had been at it for hours or maybe even days. For a moment, Maria just stared in complete shock. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in real life, did they? But there they were, 3 helpless infants in the middle of the forest, miles from the nearest house. With trembling hands, Maria crawled into the shelter to get a closer look. The babies were wrapped in blankets that looked like they hadn't been changed in days. 2 appeared to be girls with wisps of dark hair, and 1 was clearly a boy. They all looked severely underfed, their little faces gaunt and their cries weak. Next to the babies, partially hidden under a moldy towel, Maria found a piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky and rushed, written in blue ink that had smeared from moisture. The note was short and heartbreaking. "Please help them." "I cannot." Maria's mind raced as she tried to process what she was seeing. Someone had left these babies here, but why? Who could abandon helpless infants in the middle of the forest? And how long had they been here alone? One of the baby girls had stopped crying and was looking up at Maria with unfocused eyes. She was so small and fragile that Maria was afraid to touch her, but she also couldn't just leave them here. The October weather was getting colder each day, and nights in the forest could be brutal. As Maria knelt there surrounded by the 3 babies, she realized her own problems suddenly seemed small in comparison. Yes, her family struggled with money and her future felt uncertain, but these babies were fighting for their lives, completely helpless and dependent on whoever might find them. The weight of the situation hit her like a falling tree. She was just 16 years old, living in poverty, with no experience caring for babies. Her own family could barely afford to feed themselves. But looking at those 3 tiny faces, Maria knew she couldn't walk away. These babies needed help immediately, and for better or worse, she was the only person who had found them. The question that terrified her was simple. What was she going to do about it? The forest around them was completely silent except for the babies' weak cries, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Maria stared at the 3 babies for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The smallest baby, one of the girls, had stopped crying and seemed to be looking right at her with glassy, unfocused eyes. That scared Maria more than the crying had. She knew she had to do something, but what? Her first thought was to run home and call for help. But even as the idea formed, doubts crept in. What if the authorities split the babies up? What if they ended up in some overcrowded facility where nobody really cared about them? Maria had heard horror stories about the system, about kids who got lost in it and never found their way out. But these weren't just any kids. These were babies, helpless and sick. As Maria looked closer, she could see that their tiny lips looked dry and cracked. When had they last eaten? When had anyone changed them or held them? Making a decision that would change everything, Maria carefully picked up the smallest baby girl. She was so light it frightened Maria. Babies were supposed to be chubby and warm, weren't they? This little one felt fragile, like she might break if Maria held her wrong. "It's okay," Maria whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the baby or to herself. "I'm going to figure this out, but how?" Maria was 16, broke, and living in a trailer where there was barely enough food for the people already there. She couldn't just walk in with 3 babies and expect her mother to somehow make it work. Rosa was already stretched beyond her limits, working from dawn to dusk just to keep them afloat. As Maria held the baby, an idea began to form. It wasn't a good idea, and she knew it, but it was the only one she had. There was an old barn about half a mile away on the abandoned property, next to their trailer park. The owners had moved away years ago, and the barn was mostly forgotten, hidden behind overgrown trees and weeds. If she could get the babies there, she could take care of them herself. Just temporarily until she figured out what to do. She had babysitting experience with Diego and Carlos, after all. How different could it be? The next few hours were the hardest of Maria's life. She made 3 separate trips through the forest, carrying 1 baby at a time along with their makeshift bedding and the few supplies she found in the shelter. Each journey took nearly an hour, and by the time she had all 3 babies safely in the barn, the sun was starting to set. The barn was old and drafty, but it was dry and hidden from view. Maria used some old horse blankets she found to create a makeshift nursery in one corner. The babies seemed a little calmer in their new environment, though they were still crying on and off. That night, Maria barely slept. She snuck out of the trailer after her mother came home from work, telling Rosa she was going for a walk. Instead, she spent hours in the barn trying to figure out how to care for 3 infants with nothing but determination and desperation. The babies were hungry, that much was obvious. But Maria had no idea what babies their age were supposed to eat. She had about $23 in her wallet, money she had saved from occasional babysitting jobs. It would have to be enough to start with. The next morning, after getting Diego and Carlos off to school, Maria walked to the small grocery store in town. She felt like everyone was staring at her as she bought baby formula, diapers, and bottles. The total came to $18, leaving her with $5 to her name. "Big family?" asked Jenny, the cashier who had known Maria since she was little. "Oh, these are for my neighbor," Maria lied, her cheeks burning. She ran out and can't get to the store. Back at the barn, Maria discovered that feeding babies was much harder than she had imagined. The formula had to be mixed just right, and the babies were so weak they barely knew how to suck from the bottles. It took forever to get even a little bit into each of them. But slowly, over the next 2 days, Maria began to see small improvements. The babies cried less, and their tiny faces didn't look quite so pale. She was proud of herself for making a difference, even though she was exhausted beyond belief. Maria had always been a good student when she was in school, so she decided to do some research. During her mother's work hours, she walked to the public library and used their computers to look up information about infant care. What she read made her stomach sink. Babies this young needed to eat every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. They needed their diapers changed constantly. Most importantly, they needed medical attention if they showed any signs of illness. And according to the websites Maria was reading, all 3 babies were showing multiple warning signs. The smallest girl had developed a fever that worried Maria sick. She would feel hot to the touch, then cold, then hot again. One of the babies had started making a wheezing sound when he breathed. And the 3rd baby had barely eaten anything in the past day despite Maria's best efforts. By the 3rd night, Maria knew she was in way over her head. She sat in the barn, surrounded by crying babies, feeling more helpless than she had ever felt in her life. Her savings were gone, spent on formula and diapers. She was surviving on maybe 2 hours of sleep a night, sneaking back and forth between the trailer and the barn. Worse, she could see that the babies weren't getting better. If anything, they seemed to be getting worse. The wheezing baby was now making scary rattling sounds. The feverish baby felt burning hot even when Maria tried to cool her down with damp cloths. And the 3rd baby had become so listless that Maria had to wake her up to try to get her to eat. Maria had never felt so scared and alone. She wanted to call her mother to ask for help, but Rosa was barely keeping their own family together. How could Maria dump 3 sick babies on top of everything else? She had also started to think about the person who had left these babies in the forest. The note had said, "I cannot," but what did that mean exactly? Had their mother been unable to care for them? Had something terrible happened? Maria found herself wondering if somewhere out there, someone was worried sick about these 3 little ones. But mostly, Maria was terrified that she was going to fail them. Despite all her efforts, despite going without sleep and spending every penny she had, the babies were still suffering. She was just one teenager with no experience and no resources. What had made her think she could save them? As she sat in the cold barn that 3rd night, listening to the babies cry and feeling completely overwhelmed, Maria realized she had to make another choice. She had tried to handle this on her own, and it wasn't working. The babies needed real help, the kind she couldn't provide no matter how much she wanted to. The question was who to trust with 3 lives that had somehow become her responsibility. Because that's what this was about now. It wasn't about Maria's fears or her distrust of the system anymore. It was about 3 helpless babies who deserved a real chance at life. And Maria was finally ready to admit that saving them was going to take more than just her good intentions. Maria sat on the floor of the old barn, her back against the rough wooden wall, watching the 3 babies sleep fitfully on the horse blankets. It was 4 a.m, and she hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in 3 days. Her whole body ached, her eyes burned, and her heart felt like it might break from the weight of responsibility she was carrying. The smallest baby girl was running another fever, and her breathing had become shallow and quick. The little boy's wheezing had gotten worse, making scary rattling sounds that Maria had never heard before. Even the 3rd baby, who had been the strongest of the 3, was now barely responding when Maria tried to wake her for feeding. Maria knew she was failing them. Despite everything she had tried, despite giving up sleep and spending her last $5 on more formula, the babies were getting sicker. She had read enough online to know that they needed real medical help, not just the desperate care of a 16-year-old girl who was making everything up as she went along. But who could she trust? The question had been spinning in her mind for hours. Calling 911 felt like giving up control completely. Once she made that call, other people would make all the decisions about what happened to these babies. They might get separated, sent to different places, lost in a system that didn't always have happy endings. Maria had been in that system herself when she was younger, after her father's drinking got really bad and social services got involved. She remembered the feeling of being powerless, of having her life decided by strangers who barely knew her name. She didn't want that for these babies. As the first hints of dawn started to creep through the gaps in the barn walls, Maria found herself thinking about Mrs. Chen. Elizabeth Chen ran the only daycare in their small town, a cheerful place called Little Sprouts that Maria walked past every day on her way to the library. Maria had worked there briefly last summer, helping with cleaning and organizing supplies to earn a little extra money. Mrs. Chen was different from most adults Maria knew. She was in her 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a way of talking to people like they mattered, regardless of their age. She had been a nurse before retiring and opening the daycare, and Maria remembered her mentioning that she had raised 5 children of her own. More importantly, Mrs. Chen had never made Maria feel ashamed about her situation. When other adults looked at Maria, she could see them calculating her circumstances. Dropped out of school, no father around, living in the trailer park. Their expressions would shift, becoming either pitying or judgmental. But Mrs. Chen had always just treated her like a person. The memory that convinced Maria was from a particularly bad day last summer. Maria had come to work upset after her mother had to choose between paying for groceries or keeping the phone connected. She had tried to hide her tears, but Mrs. Chen noticed everything. Instead of asking intrusive questions or offering empty encouragement, Mrs. Chen had simply made Maria a cup of tea and sat with her in the small office behind the daycare's main room. She had shared a story about her own family struggles when she was young, how her parents had immigrated with nothing and worked multiple jobs just to survive. Sometimes life gives us challenges that feel too big, Mrs. Chen had said, her voice gentle but strong. But I've learned that asking for help isn't giving up. It's being smart enough to know when you need backup. Now sitting in the cold barn with 3 babies who desperately needed that backup, Maria finally understood what Mrs. Chen had meant. She was 16 years old, scared, exhausted, and completely out of her depth. These babies deserved more than her good intentions. They deserved someone who actually knew how to save them. Decision made, Maria carefully checked on each baby one more time. The feverish girl was still burning up despite Maria's attempts to cool her down. The wheezing boy was making those awful rattling sounds with every breath. The third baby was so still that Maria had to watch carefully to make sure she was still breathing. They didn't have time for Maria to be scared anymore. She slipped out of the barn just as the sun was coming up, her mind racing with how to approach Mrs. Chen. The daycare wouldn't open for several hours, but Maria remembered Mrs. Chen mentioning that she often came in early to prepare for the day. It was worth a try. Maria had never walked through town so early in the morning. Everything was quiet and peaceful, with just a few early commuters heading to work. The normalcy of it felt strange after the intensity of the past 3 days. Here was the world, going about its regular business, while Maria was carrying the biggest secret of her life. Little Sprouts Daycare sat on a corner lot, a converted house painted cheerful yellow with a small playground in the yard. Maria's heart pounded as she saw Mrs. Chen's old blue sedan parked in the driveway. The lights were on in the front office. Maria stood on the sidewalk for several minutes trying to work up the courage to knock. What if Mrs. Chen called the police immediately? What if she was angry that Maria had waited so long to ask for help? What if she blamed Maria for the babies getting sicker? But then she thought about the littlest girl's fever and the scary sounds the boy was making when he breathed. Time was running out. Maria knocked on the front door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely form a fist. After what felt like forever, she heard footsteps approaching. The door opened and Mrs. Chen appeared, wearing a cardigan over her pajamas and looking surprised. "Maria, what are you doing here so early? Is everything all right?" The kindness in Mrs. Chen's voice was Maria's undoing. All the fear and exhaustion of the past 3 days came crashing down, and before she could stop herself, she was crying. Not just a few tears, but the kind of crying that comes from deep in your chest and won't be controlled. "I need help," Maria managed to say between sobs. "There are 3 babies and they're sick, and I don't know what to do." Mrs. Chen immediately stepped outside and put her arms around Maria, not asking questions or demanding explanations, just offering comfort. After a few minutes, when Maria's crying had slowed down, Mrs. Chen gently led her inside to the small office where they had shared tea months before. "Tell me everything," Mrs. Chen said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made Maria feel like everything might actually be okay. So Maria told her. About finding the babies in the forest, about moving them to the barn, about trying to care for them with no experience and no money, about the fever and the wheezing and her growing terror that they were going to die because she didn't know how to help them. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When Maria finished, Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the situation. "First thing," Mrs. Chen said, "you did the right thing coming to me. Those babies are lucky you found them, and they're lucky you cared enough to try to help them, even when you didn't know what you were doing." "But they're getting worse," Maria said, fresh tears starting. "I think I made everything worse by waiting so long." "No," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "You kept them alive for 3 days. That matters. Now let's get them the help they need." Mrs. Chen moved with the efficiency of someone who had handled crises before. She grabbed her nursing bag from a cabinet and her car keys from the desk. "We're going to get those babies right now. Then I'm going to make some phone calls to people I trust, people who will make sure these babies get proper medical care without getting lost in red tape." As they drove toward the barn, Mrs. Chen explained her plan. She had contacts in the medical community and social services, people she had worked with for years who shared her philosophy of putting children's needs first. Instead of just calling 911 and hoping for the best, she was going to coordinate a response that would prioritize keeping the babies together and getting them immediate medical attention. "What about me?" Maria asked quietly. "Will I get in trouble?" Mrs. Chen glanced at her with a small smile. "Honey, you saved 3 lives. Anyone who has a problem with that will have to go through me first." For the first time in 3 days, Maria felt something like hope. When Mrs. Chen first laid eyes on the 3 babies in the old barn, Maria watched her face change completely. The older woman had seen a lot in her years as a nurse and raising 5 children, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The babies looked even worse in the morning light than they had in the dim barn the night before. "Oh my goodness," Mrs. Chen whispered, immediately kneeling beside the makeshift bed Maria had created. She opened her nursing bag and pulled out a stethoscope, thermometer, and other medical supplies Maria didn't recognize. "How long have they been like this?" "The fever started 2 days ago," Maria said, wrapping her arms around herself. "And the little boy's breathing got really bad yesterday." Mrs. Chen worked quickly, checking each baby with the skill of someone who had done this thousands of times before. Her face grew more serious with each examination. The smallest girl's temperature was dangerously high. The boy's lungs sounded congested, and the 3rd baby was severely dehydrated. "Maria, listen to me carefully," Mrs. Chen said, her voice calm but urgent. "These babies need to be in a hospital right now. Not in an hour, not after we figure out paperwork. Right now." Instead of calling 911, Mrs. Chen pulled out her phone and dialed a number from memory. "Dr. Patel? It's Elizabeth Chen. I need you to meet me at Regional Medical Center immediately. I have 3 infants in critical condition." Maria listened as Mrs. Chen explained the situation to someone she clearly trusted. The conversation was quick and professional, but Maria could hear the concern in both voices. When Mrs. Chen hung up, she was already gathering the babies in their blankets. "Dr. Patel is the best pediatric doctor in the county," Mrs. Chen explained as they carefully carried the babies to her car. "She's going to meet us at the hospital and make sure these little ones get exactly what they need." The drive to Regional Medical Center felt like it took forever, even though it was only 20 minutes away. Maria sat in the back seat holding the feverish baby girl, watching her tiny chest rise and fall rapidly. Mrs. Chen kept glancing in the rearview mirror, offering reassuring words, but Maria could see the worry in her eyes. At the hospital, everything happened incredibly fast. Dr. Patel was waiting at the emergency entrance with a team of nurses and 3 infant carriers. She was a woman in her 40s with gentle hands and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately made Maria feel like the babies were in good hands. "You did the right thing bringing them in," Dr. Patel told Maria, as the medical team quickly assessed each baby. "A few more hours and we might have been looking at a very different outcome." While the medical team worked to stabilize the babies, Mrs. Chen made more phone calls. Maria sat in the waiting room, feeling lost and overwhelmed by all the activity around her. She had spent 3 days as the only person responsible for these babies. And now suddenly there were doctors and nurses and social workers all taking charge. Are they going to be okay? Maria asked when Mrs. Chen finally sat down beside her. Dr. Patel thinks so, Mrs. Chen said, putting a comforting hand on Maria's shoulder. They're dehydrated and malnourished, but they're fighters. Just like someone else I know. That's when Mrs. Chen shared the first surprise of what would become a day full of them. I called my friend Linda from the County Social Services office. Instead of just filing a standard report, she's coming down here personally. She specializes in cases like this, and she's going to make sure these babies stay together. Maria's eyes widened. They can stay together? Linda has been doing this work for 25 years, Mrs. Chen explained. She knows that separating siblings, especially babies who have already been through trauma, can cause serious problems. She's going to fight to place all 3 babies with families who can keep them connected. As the hours passed, something remarkable started to happen. Word began to spread through their small town about what Maria had done. Jenny from the grocery store had mentioned to her neighbor about the teenager buying baby supplies. The neighbor worked at the hospital and recognized Maria in the waiting room. By afternoon, half the town knew about the girl who had found 3 abandoned babies and kept them alive for 3 days. But instead of judgment or criticism for not calling authorities immediately, the community responded with something Maria had never experienced before: overwhelming support and admiration. The first person to show up was Pastor Williams from the community church, carrying bags of baby supplies and an envelope full of cash donations. The congregation took up a collection, he explained to Mrs. Chen. They want to help with medical expenses and whatever else these babies need. Next came the owner of the local hardware store with his wife, both carrying more supplies. We heard what the young lady did, the wife said, smiling at Maria. That took real courage. By evening, the hospital waiting room looked like a donation center. People Maria barely knew had brought diapers, formula, baby clothes, blankets, and toys. The hospital staff had to open an extra room just to store everything. But the most overwhelming moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez, who owned the town's Mexican restaurant, arrived with her teenage daughter Ana. Maria recognized Ana from school. They had been in the same grade before Maria dropped out. My mom wanted to meet the girl who saved 3 babies, Ana said, looking at Maria with something like awe. She says you're a hero. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. I'm not a hero. I couldn't leave them there. That's exactly what makes you a hero, Mrs. Rodriguez said in accented English, her eyes kind and warm. Not everyone would do what you did. Most people would have walked away or called someone else to handle it. You took responsibility when those babies had no one else. As the day continued, Maria learned that the community response was being coordinated by Mrs. Chen, who seemed to know everyone in town. She had called the local newspaper not for publicity, but to help organize the donation efforts. She had reached out to the town council to see about creating an emergency fund for situations like this. Most surprisingly, she had convinced 3 local families to apply as emergency foster families, specifically for sibling groups. It's not easy to place 3 babies together, Mrs. Chen explained. But this town is full of good people who are willing to step up when children need help. Late that evening, Dr. Patel came out to update everyone on the baby's condition. The waiting room was still full of community members who had stayed to hear the news. All 3 babies are going to be fine, she announced. And the relief in the room was almost tangible. They're dehydrated and underweight, but they're responding well to treatment. The little girl's fever broke an hour ago, the boy's breathing is much clearer, and the 3rd baby is already showing more alertness. The room erupted in quiet cheers and applause. Maria felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in days, they were tears of relief rather than fear. Dr. Patel continued, I want everyone to know that these babies are alive because of Maria's quick thinking and dedication. She kept them fed, warm, and cared for during the most critical period. Her actions absolutely saved their lives. As the crowd began to disperse, many people stopped to speak with Maria personally. Some shared stories of their own struggles. Others simply wanted to thank her for her courage. A few offered her jobs or other kinds of support for her own family. Mrs. Chen had been right about her friend Linda from social services. By the end of the day, Linda had identified 2 families in the area who were willing and able to adopt the babies while keeping them connected. The Mitchell family, who owned the local veterinary clinic, wanted to adopt 2 of the babies. The Kumar family, who ran the town's pharmacy, was interested in adopting the third baby but was committed to maintaining sibling relationships. "This almost never happens," Linda told Maria privately. "Usually we're lucky if we can place siblings in the same county. But this community has really stepped up. These babies are going to grow up knowing each other, and they're going to know the story of the brave girl who saved their lives." As Maria finally prepared to go home that night, Mrs. Chen pulled her aside. "The families want to know what names you've been calling the babies," she said. "They think you should have the honor of naming them officially." Maria thought about the 3 days she had spent with the babies, watching over them, worrying about them, loving them even though she barely knew how to care for them. "Hope," she said finally. "Faith and Gabriel," Mrs. Chen smiled. Perfect names for 3 little fighters. Walking out of the hospital that night, Maria felt like she was seeing her town with completely new eyes. These weren't just the people she passed on the street or bought groceries from. These were people who had dropped everything to help 3 babies they had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. And somehow, in the process of saving 3 abandoned babies, Maria had discovered something she had never expected to find: a community that was willing to fight for her too. 2 weeks after the babies had been admitted to the hospital, Maria was sitting in Mrs. Chen's office at the daycare when Linda from social services called with news that would shock everyone involved. The babies were doing much better, gaining weight and responding well to care, but the investigation into their origins had taken an unexpected turn. "We ran DNA tests to try to identify the baby's family," Linda explained over the phone, her voice carrying a strange mixture of concern and excitement. "Maria, you're not going to believe what we discovered." Maria's heart started racing. After everything that had happened, she had almost forgotten that somewhere out there was a person who had left these babies in the forest. The note had been so brief, so desperate, that Maria had imagined all sorts of tragic scenarios about what might have driven someone to such an extreme decision. "The biological mother is a 17-year-old girl named Jennifer Walsh," Linda continued. "She's been living in Riverside, about 30 miles from where you found the babies. Maria, she's been missing for 4 months. Her foster family reported her as a runaway, but nobody knew she was pregnant." Mrs. Chen and Maria exchanged shocked glances. A 17-year-old girl, only 1 year older than Maria herself. Someone who had been living on her own, carrying triplets with no support system at all. "There's more," Linda said. "We found her yesterday. She's been living in an abandoned building on the outskirts of Riverside, surviving on whatever food she could find or afford. When the police approached her, she immediately asked about the babies. Maria, she's been walking to that forest every day for 2 weeks, hoping to find some sign that someone had discovered them." Maria felt like all the air had been sucked out of her lungs. While she had been worrying about the babies and dealing with the overwhelming community response, their mother had been walking miles every day, desperately hoping they were safe. "Is she in trouble?" Maria asked quietly. "Are they going to arrest her?" "That's the surprising part," Linda said. "The district attorney reviewed the case and decided not to press charges. Jennifer left the babies where she believed they would be found, with a note asking for help. Legally, it's considered infant safe surrender under our state's safe haven laws, even though it wasn't at a traditional location like a hospital or fire station." Over the next few days, Maria learned Jennifer's story, and it broke her heart in ways she hadn't expected. Jennifer had aged out of the foster care system at 18, with no family support and nowhere to go. She had been working odd jobs, sleeping in her car, when she discovered she was pregnant with triplets. Too scared and ashamed to seek help, Jennifer had tried to handle the pregnancy on her own. When the babies came early while she was camping in the forest, she had been completely unprepared. She had spent 2 days trying to care for 3 newborns with no supplies, no help, and no idea what to do. She left them there because she thought it was their only chance, Mrs. Chen explained to Maria after visiting Jennifer in the hospital where she was recovering. She had heard that people sometimes walk those trails, and she hoped someone would find them quickly. Then she went back to check on them every day, but you had already moved them. The shocking revelation became even more meaningful when Mrs. Chen suggested something that surprised everyone. "I think Maria should meet Jennifer," she told Linda. "These 2 young women have more in common than anyone realizes." The meeting took place at the hospital, in a quiet room with Linda and Mrs. Chen present for support. Maria was nervous about what to expect, but when she saw Jennifer, She immediately understood what Mrs. Chen had meant. Jennifer looked like Maria might have looked after living on the streets for months. She was thin, exhausted, and had the same defeated expression Maria used to see in her own mirror. But when Jennifer saw Maria, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude that made Maria start crying too. "You saved them," Jennifer whispered, reaching out to grab Maria's hands. "I was so scared I had killed them by leaving them there. But you saved them." "I almost didn't know what to do either," Maria admitted. "I was so scared the whole time." As the two teenagers talked, something remarkable began to happen. Instead of judgment or resentment, they found understanding. Both had been forced to grow up too fast. Both had faced impossible situations with no good choices. Both had tried to do the right thing despite being terrified. Jennifer's situation sparked the same community response that had supported the babies. When people learned about the young mother who had been living homeless and alone during her pregnancy, donations began pouring in for her too. The same families who had brought supplies for the babies now brought clothes, food, and offers of help for Jennifer. Pastor Williams arranged for Jennifer to stay in a small apartment behind the church while she recovered and figured out her next steps. Mrs. Rodriguez offered her a job at the restaurant once she was strong enough to work. Most importantly, the community made it clear that Jennifer wasn't being judged for her desperate decision, but supported for the courage it had taken to seek help for her babies. The adoption process took several months to finalize, but it happened exactly as Linda had hoped. Dr. Mitchell and his wife Patricia adopted Hope and Faith, while the Kumar family, who ran the town pharmacy, adopted Gabriel. Both families lived within a few blocks of each other and were committed to raising the children as siblings. But the most surprising development was the relationship that grew between Jennifer and the adoptive families. Instead of a traditional closed adoption, all parties agreed to maintain contact. Jennifer would be part of the children's lives, not as their primary parent, but as someone who loved them and wanted to watch them grow up. "It's unusual," Linda admitted. "But this whole situation has been unusual. Sometimes the best solution isn't the one you find in the textbook." As the months passed, Maria watched the ripple effects of that October morning continue to spread through her community. The story had attracted attention from neighboring towns, leading to the establishment of a regional program to help homeless teenagers and young mothers. Mrs. Chen had started a program at the daycare to teach basic child care skills to teenagers. Inspired by Maria's determination to learn how to care for the babies, Jennifer became one of the first participants once she was settled in her apartment. Most remarkably, Maria's own life began to change in ways she had never imagined possible. The community's support hadn't stopped with the babies. When people learned about Maria's situation, about how she had dropped out of school to help her family, they wanted to help her too. A scholarship fund was established in Maria's name, allowing her to complete her high school education online while working part-time. Local businesses offered her flexible jobs that worked around her studies. Mrs. Chen hired her as a permanent assistant at the daycare, teaching her skills that would prove invaluable later. But the biggest change came when Dr. Mitchell approached Maria with an unexpected offer. "Have you ever thought about becoming a nurse?" she asked during one of the regular visits to check on the baby's progress. "You have natural instincts for caregiving, and you handled a medical emergency better than some trained professionals I know." The idea had never occurred to Maria, but the more she thought about it, the more it felt right. With the community's support, Maria began taking college courses while working at the daycare. It wasn't easy juggling school, work, and helping her family, but it was possible in a way that had never seemed achievable before. 3 years later, Maria graduated with her nursing degree. Her first job was at Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where she had brought 3 dying babies on a desperate October morning. On her first day of work, Maria was assigned to the pediatric ward. As she walked through the halls in her crisp scrubs, she passed the emergency room where everything had changed for her. Dr. Patel, who was now her colleague, stopped to welcome her to the team. "It's good to have you here," Dr. Patel said with a smile. "Those babies were lucky you found them, but I think our future patients are going to be even luckier to have you as their nurse." That weekend, Maria attended Gabriel's 3rd birthday party at the Kumar family's house. Hope and Faith were there too, with the Mitchells, and all 3 children were healthy, happy, and clearly loved. Jennifer was there as well, now working as a certified nursing assistant and planning to follow in Maria's footsteps by studying to become a registered nurse. As Maria watched the children play in the backyard, she thought about that terrifying morning in the forest when her biggest worry had been whether they would survive the day. Now Hope was a chatty 3-year-old who loved books. Faith was fascinated by anything that moved, and Gabriel was already showing signs of the determination that had kept him alive during those critical first days. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just kept walking that morning?" Jennifer asked, joining Maria on the porch where she was watching the party. Maria considered the question seriously. If she had walked past that shelter, if she had convinced herself it wasn't her responsibility, if she had been too scared to get involved. The babies would have died, certainly, but she would have missed out on discovering a strength she never knew she had, a community she never knew existed, and a purpose that had completely transformed her.